Welcome to the Compile Podcast. This is a show where two programmers talk about anything and everything. My name is Nick Wu, and I'm the host of this podcast. In each episode, we'll have a topic, and the goal of the episode is to compile the topic down into a list of essential points for our listeners. Each guest will have their own list to compile so that we don't always have to agree on everything. This week, we are joined by a recurring guest, John. How are you doing, John?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, we actually haven't spoken for like 6 months. So
yeah, I think at least.
A lot has changed. So how have you been? I heard you actually quite just moved recently though, right?
I did, yeah. So about 2 months back, I finally officially graduated and moved out to Mountain View, California to start working full time.
Yes. So what company is that?
I'm working at Amazon.
Okay.
AWS specifically. But...
Right. And is there any bit of your work that you can let me know?
I am currently focused on the customer-facing stuff, so sort of the UI stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And my team does the database analytics and AI dashboards on AWS.
Well, that's very comprehensive. That's sort of like throughout the stack, you get through.
It is, exactly.
Yeah.
And there's we own I'm not sure how specific I'm allowed to be, but we own a large number of the dashboards on AWS, so it's been cool to get a lot of breadth from my team.
Yes. I have some brief experiences with AWS. Actually, the audio recordings of these podcasts are actually stored on AWS and on S3. And
yeah,
my experience was just an overwhelming amount of technologies available at AWS. It's like amazing how much stuff that's on there.
And it's just exploding. Like it seems like every month at least there's multiple new services. I think there's hundreds of services on AWS now. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, I was shocked because I went to sort of this like landing page and I was like, oh, I'm just gonna load up like a storage, and there's a search. First of all, there's a search bar. There's not even like there's not even like sessionized. So there's too much. It has to have a search bar, and then I searched for storage, and then I got like 50 results. So
yeah, it can be a little overwhelming.
Yeah, that's a bit crazy. Anyway, so congrats on the new job. Actually, never actually said this out loud, but again, congrats on the new job.
Yeah, well, congratulations to you. So what team have you landed on now that you're full time? I'm not sure we've talked much since you officially started.
No, actually, yeah, because I started in last September in the Essence Pulp Controls team. So you can think of our job as the waiter at a restaurant. So when you go to the restaurant, you can order your stuff to the waiter, and then you can say, oh, actually, I'm allergic to nuts, so please don't put any nuts on my food. So what we will do is our publishers will tell us, there are some sort of ads they don't like. For example, people don't want ads about guns on their website, or ads about gambling. That's going to affect their brand, and they tell us, and we tell the rest of Google to be, hey, don't show gun ads on this publisher. And so yeah, that's basically what we do. On a high level, we are doing brand safety for our publishers.
Yeah, that seems super important. I know there's been a lot of talk about brand safety in the news in the last year or two.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pretty cool to be working on something that's very, I guess, well known at this point.
Yeah, it's the demand was certainly very high, and we have a lot of the cases which are like quite interesting to work with, because if you think about it, it's not just the fact that people don't want ads about like guns or things are a little bit more sensitive. There are also a use case where if I'm a bakery, I don't want ads to show on my website that's pointing to a different bakery in the same area, because so there's a lot about like competitors, and this is very common in the app business. So for like one app, for like a to-do app, you might have a banner at the end that's gonna reference a different to-do app, and that's gonna just cut into your business directly, and that's one of our valid use cases as well. And so working on this team, really uh, explores a lot of the business side of how things work, and it's very interesting.
Yeah, it sounds super cool.
Yeah, cool. So I hope that's a bit of a catch up on what we do. I know I haven't done any recordings for like 6 months, so you probably thought I disappeared, died, or so yeah, I'm still alive. We're going well, and in fact, this is the first podcast back, and I'm going to try to kickstart a regular update from now on, and we'll see how that goes. Because I usually promise these things and they don't necessarily work. If you follow my blogs, you know. Um,
Well, I'm excited. I'll keep an eye out for your upcoming
oh
ones as
yeah,
well.
now there's pressure on, so I have to perform now. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So this week's main topic is developer workflow, and tagline is how we do software projects. So this might sound a little bit too broad, but once we get down to the specifics, it's gonna make sense to you. I promise. On a high level, this is something that people in our industry do all the time. In fact, this is literally their job, where they are assigned to a project, and their job is to finish that project, to implement it. And we've actually had a certain exposure to this in at university, where they would have school projects for you to work with, and it's supposed to mimic the real life software projects, but they are quite different. In fact, the first point we're gonna try to touch on is how exactly are they different? What are the differences that we've experienced doing projects in university and now as a developer? So, John, I think there's an interesting example that I'm about to give where
Mhm.
we both took the same class in UNC, taught by the same professor, which is very heavily project based. And so I think back on that project that we've done. Actually, Brandon did this as well, and uh,
Yeah.
and then I sometimes think back to this project that we've done, and I looked at the code, and it was, I don't want to piss off the professor, but it was a bit messy. It was a little bit
Yeah,
messy. And
both
yeah, sorry, go on.
both in the one of the interesting things about it that really correlates it back to like an industry project where it isn't just like one of the different things about university or industry projects is you're dependent on code that's been written by other people, and that was my first big project in university where I had to use a lot of code written by the professor, and getting used to dealing with his code, which was partially messy, and then trying to implement our messy code on top of it was a real learning experience.
Oh yeah, at the time we have source control, but it's a preferred, it's not a required, and in the end you're just left with the code base, which is there's no version, there's no history, and it's just a blob of code, and you have to make sense of it at the end. I mean, after we implemented it, I'm sure
Yeah.
the professor had like proper source control and proper history done before. Cool. And then this sort of like illustrates the point that I want to make is from what I experienced, and I think John, you can relate to this as well. A lot of the projects that we've done as students are unstructured. So they're unstructured in the sense where we will get assigned to a project, and we will just do it. Whereas once you join full time, as a developer, you are trained to think a little bit in, I should say, in stages. So you get a project. First of all, you need to make sure you understand what this project was supposed to be, what problem is it supposed to solve, and then you go about the rest of the stages.
Yeah. And one thing there is like in university, that step, the understanding step, in university, you're entirely just trying to understand the technical aspect of it and solve the problem technically. At least the projects I had to do were almost all solving
Yeah,
technical
yeah.
problems. Whereas in industry, a major component of it is understanding the customer and the business behind it, which you don't experience as much in university.
Yeah, definitely. the concept of a project is also a little bit different. So for university, a lot of times you are tasked with a problem that you're about to solve, where it's purely logical, purely scientific in that sense, where you write stuff, you write logic, and it's supposed to function. And if you write the correct logic, you will solve the correct problem. You just don't get to expect that in industry, where you can come up with a really good technical solution, and then it doesn't solve anything, like it doesn't solve the problem. And also, another thing is about you know the, I should say, metrics to go for. So when we were in university, all we care is the code does what it's supposed to do. So we care about correctness. And in industry, you also care about correctness, of course. But there's so much more than that. And you gotta care about, is this fast enough? Is this is it gonna keep the customers waiting, or is it gonna consume a certain amount of CPU and cost us like hundreds of dollars for to AWS most likely? And yeah, so there are a lot more things that you have to keep in mind for industry projects, and compared to university ones.
Yeah, I think I'd like to dive into this a little bit more, maybe. I think it might be interesting to try outlining like the type of considerations that we thought about when working on the project in that class we had together, and maybe so some of the things we had to think about was just getting the demos to work, right?
Oh,
we just had like the end goal for that class and how we present. We kind of presented our final submission, which is kind of like how you do it in industry, right? You build something and then you have to present it to the business owners. But the big difference there was we just made a 15-minute video and submitted it to the TA to be graded. And as long as it looked like it worked in the video, you could be fine. You obviously cannot fake your way through it or hide bugs in industry.
No. People will exploit you left and right, especially if you like, if your website has enough traffic, then some of those traffic are attack traffic in a sense, where they're trying to explore you and trying to like gain information out of your site, or just make your site explode, and then write your angry tweet, which also happened to me. So I hope that sort of covers a little bit about the differences between school projects and industry projects. For a lot of our listeners that's still in the middle of their computer science education, I'm not knocking all of your school projects. I'm sure they are technically challenging, but just be prepared for a little bit more once you like actually go into industry.
I think it could maybe be interesting to also talk about like the other thing a lot of people that are getting computer science degrees will be doing are internships, and getting an idea of differences between intern projects and full-time projects. Since we both did internships at the same company that we are now working full-time at, correct? You interned at Google, right?
I did.
Yeah, so I maybe be interested to hear what your perspective on this was. Did you do internships anywhere but Google?
I did all my internships in Google.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I did 2 internships at a bank and 1 internship at Amazon. And I thought those were interesting because you actually had to work on a team and go through this whole process that we're going to be talking more about, but it wasn't at the same scale. I think it might be interesting to dive into a bit more about like the differences between an intern project and a full-time project.
Yeah.
Right? So like, I think in the intern projects, a lot of these companies are trying to have their interns work on more like meaningful and work on projects that'll actually be integrated into the production software.
Well, they think, but
Yeah. And they try to tell you that it will be, but oftentimes, you finish the project and you leave and you don't necessarily know like what ended up happening with it. And I guess just trying to think about when you're doing an internship, focusing on the aspects of working with a team. And like a big aspect that's different between university and industry is you have to write code that's not just for you, it's for the rest of your team, and for it's not just to turn in and be done with, it needs to last for a long time.
Yeah, that's such a good point. There's two. John said a awesome point just now, and I just want to reiterate this bit. Going from my experience, going from school to internships and then now to full time, you just feel the scale of things like go up more and more, and then it kind of goes like I don't want to say exponentially, but it kind of feels like that way. From working alone or like some school projects are in teams, but they won't be too big. It's going to be like 3 to 4 people. To like working in as an intern in a large team, probably 6 to 8 people, and then working full time and having to deal with the rest of the company. And this just feels a lot different. It actually perfectly reflects the point that what's the book? What's the book that the UNC professor wrote?
Oh, I don't actually know the
Oh,
name of his
mystical
book.
Memnon. There we go. Yeah.
Yes.
So in his book, he says like as you grow the number of programmers or number of work, number of people, it doesn't the productivity doesn't grow um, on the same level. It actually grows a lot slower because you have all these communication, all of this lag time, so to speak, in between any pair of people. And another point that John just said was you should expect your stuff to last, and you should expect your code to go beyond uh, the submission day, so to speak. And that's true for intern projects. And you wanna sort of think about after you leave, the people in your team are going to be working with the code you wrote. So just be mindful of that. And once you join full time, once you work on a real life project, there is no submission time. Like it will forever be on until the company decides to shut it down, which is probably never. And
Yep.
yeah, so there's a lot about writing code, making sure you're doing things that won't come back. Like you're not taking any shortcuts or any sort of like dirty shortcuts, which is gonna like bite you in the butt later, because it's
Mhm.
your butt. It's not somebody else's butt anymore. So
That's another really interesting point is like shortcuts, because I don't know what your experience is, but in industry, you still do sometimes have to take shortcuts because
hmm
you have deadlines and you have launches you need to meet and you have customer expectations you need to meet. You
yeah.
can't write 100% perfect code 100% of the time.
hmm
And that's one of the biggest challenges about full time work, I think, is having a good understanding of when it's appropriate to take shortcuts or to make something slightly hacky,
yeah.
and when it's worth doing the hackier solution and then coming back and iterating on it
hmm
if needed.
Yeah, definitely. That's actually an amazing point. That's actually one of the points I was gonna make a little bit later. But yeah, cool. So another thing I want to cover, I sort of said this point before, where you come into industry and then now you have a procedure or sort of a framework on how to work these software projects, sort of like a meta thing. So I want to cover that bit a little bit more. I'm
Mhm.
sure, like for a lot of people listening, these will be like stuff they've already learned in school or in the books. But I just want to cover them very quickly. Um,
So,
yeah, sorry.
well, I'll let you describe them first, and then I want to follow up on that. Did you like if you talked about these in university?
Okay, cool. So normally you will have one or two main ways to go about this. One of them is a waterfall. You can think of it as a waterfall going from top to bottom. And the way it was described is, you define your stages and you just do them one by one in sequence. And in fact, a very important characteristic of this is you don't start the second step until you completely finish the first step. The second sort of approach is more called an agile approach, where you have you have a rough idea of what things are supposed to be, and then you define a sort of a bare bone version of that, and then you go through the stages, then you reiterate, and then you reiterate, and you do this until you're happy with the final result or what you've gotten. Yeah, so these are the two uh, main sort of approaches to software projects. And John, what's your takeaway on this bit?
Yeah, so I've actually never really working on a team that follows a waterflow practice. I mean, a practice.
Mm-hmm.
Um, all the teams I've worked with do more the agile approach, where you you have like a backlog of things that need to get done, right? And
Yeah.
you kind of prioritize those items and just work through them as fast as you can. And they're sort of compartmentalized.
Mm-hmm.
So as you finish one of these smaller subtasks, you can sort of do a related thing, continuous deployment, where, you know, instead of waiting for the whole full product to be complete, you can release components of the product as you go,
Yes.
which is super valuable to the customer because they can see continuous improvements from your continuous deployments without having to wait for you to finish the whole thing.
Yeah.
Um, do you have any experience with waterfall, or have you mostly done agile as well?
That's a good question. And for I would say for a lot of the projects I'm doing right now, it's sort of a mixture of both. Because you think about a product, and you definitely want to have all of the good things from Agile. You want to be continuously delivering value, and you want to like always tackle the most important thing. And that definitely works when you have small enough tasks to be carried out in a matter of days. But when you have a more complex problem or a complex feature to implement, which is going to probably take up weeks or even months, then it's more likely that I personally will go with a little bit more waterfall-y approach, where I'll do my research, I'll do my design, and then I'll go through like all the tasks to be carried out. But I will say this isn't exactly waterfall, because everybody cuts corners, and that's what we do. So so that's why
Yeah,
when we do this, we do during the waterfall. At some point we say, oh, but we can't really do all of this within the timeline that we have. So we're gonna do a subset that still works, and then reiterate, and then we go back to the agile thing. So you see, like, this is sort of like an interplay
hmm
of both approaches.
yeah. I think it comes down to the core problem is some components aren't useful without the other components, right? So if you have some big product, like there's your ideal version of the product with everything perfectly implemented that obviously you can never actually have. And then there's sort of the minimum viable product,
Hmm.
I guess. And then there's sort of the task to get you from nothing to the minimum viable
Yep.
product, and then from the minimum viable product to the perfect version.
Mm.
And I think I don't know what it's like on your team, but I'm currently working on a new service that is all internal to Amazon right now. So we're trying to get to the minimum viable product point right
Yep.
now. And so we are sort of more like what you talked about, where um, we obviously have to have these large goals that are possibly months long to complete the core part of the product. But then there's also, small improvements you can do on top of the core part of the product that are more like um, stepping towards that ideal version of it.
Yeah, definitely. And just to give a little bit more context on this bit, so our product is already out there. It's in the wild. So the publisher controls is there, but we are lacking things. Like, we're lacking capabilities and features, and things we can that actually brings value, but they're in a bit of more. We've already got a minimum product that works, and now we're trying to take a second step towards the ultimate goal. And and doing this means we actually like take a million like little steps, and we sort of bundle them together into like bigger projects, and then we work them individually. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think It does, and I think this is interesting. It kind of ties into the next point on our kind of topic list of sort of the planning.
Yeah.
Um, and maybe if we go back and compare how planning works in university versus in
Hmm.
industry, I think there's some interesting stuff there. So you were sort of saying, so when you're planning an industry, you have to figure out what is the minimum viable product,
Hmm.
right? That's not something that like exist independent of your kind of opinions and planning.
Hmm.
Um, Obviously, you can't wait until you have that ideal perfect product to release it to a customer
Hmm.
because like you're never going to get to that point. So you have to be able to define some minimum viable product, which isn't something you really do in university, right? It's either the project is done or it's not done, or
Yeah.
you've completed some milestone or you haven't, right?
Hmm.
There isn't the idea of what is good enough to let people start using this.
Yeah. And definitely, another point I want to try to make is, just going back to what we did in the distributed system class, where we are given a project and we know what we want to do. Like we know what we eventually want to be, but what happens is we just like we just shoot for that. Like there's no sort of a bit of our planning that goes, oh, let me do like a dirty version or like a simple version of this that works first, and then I'll improve upon it. At least for me, a lot of the times it was just like, oh, we're gonna do this communication protocol, let's just do it. And
Mhm.
and yeah, so that's probably one thing that I could have done differently, and it actually would have helped. With the project that we have in that class, doing just spending a little bit more time thinking about how am I going to plan this. Am I going to do like a one-time sweep where I just shoot for the goal directly, or am I going to do what I just said, where I'm gonna do a simple version and and then improve upon that. These are the things that you know you might think about. You might go through this process and still think, oh, I actually don't have time to iterate, and then I'm just gonna shoot for the goal directly. But it's important to have that process to think about. Do we want to commit to this instead of just going for it straight away? Because there are some cases where if you are dealing with the perfect example is some sort of web page. The design never is there's never a stable design. It will change. If you shoot for that and then you write your code in a way that only works with that layout or that sort of particular interaction, and then the designer says, "Oh, we're gonna change this," then you're kind of screwed. You have to start over, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you start with a minimum product and then you say, "Oh, this is what we have now," it doesn't really fit with the interaction pattern that our designer wants, but we can improve upon it. In fact, we have the flexibility to switch to any sort of interaction pattern that is better for our user potentially. So that's to me
Yeah.
sounds a lot better than just go for the goal straight off.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's part of like learning how to write code with the team and learning how to write code that you can maintain in the long run because you do have to like even once you've submitted it you have to go back to the same code and be able to update it and adjust it based on customer feedback or developments in the industry or whatever these new changes are.
Yeah.
The code is always alive really.
Hmm.
um, and I also want to go back a little bit to the project we did, sort of the specific example, because I think that actually was a good opportunity to do something similar to industry because the project in that class, and if anyone has the opportunity to, so let me describe the project a little bit. Essentially, we were in this distributed systems class, and it was sort of a semester long project or a large part of the
Yeah.
semester and we were implementing different distributed communication protocols, basically.
Hmm.
And the nice part about it that sort of correlates to industry is we had to implement all these different protocols within the same project. There was like a UI that we had to interact with, and all of the underlying communication had to work within that same project. So you kind of did have to think about, okay, I'm implementing, communication protocol A, and I know in a month I'm going to have to implement communication protocol B. I need to make sure I set this whole thing up in a way where I can come back and make changes and make additions.
Yeah.
So that was kind of a virtue of that class that I personally didn't really get in other courses.
Hmm.
So getting that experience of like the semester long project with changing goals or milestones is really important.
Yeah, that's such a good point, and that I think it's I didn't quite get in during that class while we were doing it. So I was shooting for the goal. So again, like the whole project, like on a large scale, is we're going to implement communication A, protocol B, protocol C, and John here knows that I'm gonna write communication A in a way that it does not block me too much to add B in.
Hmm.
Whereas I did a stupid thing where I just made A work, and I didn't quite think about how B and C is gonna look at. And then when B and C actually came over, I did a lot of refactoring. I had to do a lot of refactoring just to get back to the point where integrating that in is even
Yeah.
possible.
Did you?
Because like eventually, what we need to do is we're gonna show this demo program with a tuner, so you can say, oh, I want communication A over B and C, and then you can demo the thing, and then you can switch to B live, and then do a thing again. Those are the things that if you embed it in a way that doesn't work, doesn't work in process, then it's just like the demo is never gonna work.
Yeah. So in hindsight, did you think that was a good learning for you having to do that refactoring, or was it not that valuable?
It is. It definitely is. And then that's actually another point that we're going to try to make now is how do you go about design? How do you go about doing the design? Because this goes straight after the plan. It actually ties in with the planning, where you're gonna realize this point about the task, the goal is never going to be done. It's never going to finish, but we're just gonna move incrementally closer to that, and then that affects your design. Then you will say, oh, then I'm just not gonna design something that's like too strict or makes it impossible for me to change direction in the future. And I'm quite sure, like I'm pretty sure this sounds very abstract and hard to sort of use in real life, but just keep that thought in mind when you are doing this project, and at some point it will make sense to you. And I was wondering, John, do you have like apart from this topic, this project, do you have a different examples that maybe illustrates
Yeah,
that?
so with the kind of design, let me give a specific example from my work that happened last week, actually. So, we're still in this stage where all internal. We haven't released anything yet. So there are still design decisions being made. Um, and my team works, basically, there are three teams that are working on my project. And something that I've had to experience is when another team makes a change that impacts me, because when you're in university or in an internship, you're usually focused on just what your team is doing, and you don't have to
Hmm.
worry as much about what other teams are doing or how other teams' changes might affect you. But as soon
Yeah,
as
it's
you're
very yeah. Sorry. It's very sandboxed.
Yes. And it's like you were saying, yeah, it's growing exponentially. Once you start in industry, you really do have to start worrying about the company as a whole, as you said earlier. So essentially, the one of the teams we worked with decided they needed to redo the design of their API, which to
Oh.
them doesn't seem, and this is something we need to have some communication on, and it goes back to that man hours thing. So they decided they needed to make some changes to their API, which isn't a big deal to them because they own their whole product, and they can kind of just go through their code base and almost control F or do some automatic refactoring and change some names or whatever.
Hmm.
But this obviously is going to have a more detrimental impact on the teams that depend on them, because now we have to go in and refactor our code because of changes they've done, because
Hmm.
not enough focus was put into the design process early. So it's not something that everyone always gets right. And you do have to be prepared for this type of thing to happen. And that's obviously not something that you really get an opportunity to experience working on teams of at most, 4 people or 5 people or whatever in university or in an internship.
No, no, definitely not. And that's such a good point. And I actually got a joke to make, but it might get that in uni where you have a professor that changes their minds every now and then.
Yeah, like we kind of did with that distributed systems projects. That code was changing and breaking.
Yeah, and just going back to this, but I actually I might do another topic on design only because this goes very deep, and there's
Yes.
like books and books and books about these topics. And just a quick point I want to make, like a quick sort of tip that you can use in design is before you think about any you can just think about your high level components like a blob of things that does something. And a very important point is think about the communication or the interface between components. What is it going to accept and what is it going to output, and how does the whole thing work? These are the things that you want to get down as quickly as possible, because once it sticks, it's very hard to change. Like
Yep.
exactly what happens in the example that John gave. If you define an API, then you change it, whoever depends on your API will break.
Yep.
There's no question to that. It will break.
Yeah, and if you only have one team or something that's dependent on it, like we do right now, it's not the end of the world. But as soon as you release it to the public and whoever can be using your API, you cannot make any changes to it because
Mhm.
you have an unknown number of people that are dependent on it, that all will have their stuff break. So yeah, at some point it has to be set in stone, and you have to be happy with it.
Yeah, definitely. So another thing I want to point out, like in these main stages, is another thing that you might not really get in university, but you want to watch out for, going forward, is apart from your code, there's also code reviews, which is like a very big thing for all the companies that you're going to. Unreviewed code is not code. It's just ideas. John, do you have any like crazy stories on this one? Or
Um,
do you want to expand on that a little bit more?
I have two stories that come to mind. I'll give one that I think is just generally applicable. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, like you said, code isn't code until it's been reviewed, but getting people to review your code can be a little difficult because obviously everyone is focused on the problem they need to solve. And getting reviews done is important, and it's everyone's job to do code reviews, but it can be hard to prioritize this. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about prioritizing various things later, but you have to be kind of ready when you come into industry to know that everyone has their priorities, and
Mm-hmm.
one of your responsibilities as the writer of the code is to get it reviewed. And it is going to take some pushing sometimes, at least in my
Yeah,
experience. It's going to take pushing to get other people to contribute, to review your code. And that's sort of just a fact of life that you have to get used to. So i'm
yeah,
i'm constantly bothering people and telling them, hey, I've got this code review published, you need to review it.
yeah, yeah. We do that all the time as well. Not recently in my team because we are sort of confined in one team. Like all the code changes are sort of isolated, so it's easier to review within the team. But I've also done some projects with teams in Mountain View, where like 8 hours apart, and getting like they they won't be able to review when I'm like sound asleep, and this it
I actually really enjoyed that. In my internship, I was in Seattle, and the person I worked the most with was in Berlin. So I would do all my code during the day, publish a code review as I was leaving, for my day's work, or maybe 2 or 3 code reviews, depending on how I broke up my code,
uh-huh.
just for the day's work, and then come back, and first thing in the morning, I'd have my code review done, and I can go in and make iterations on it.
Yeah.
And usually we'd have like an hour or two overlap in the morning, so he would. Um, if I got in and could make revisions really quickly, he could approve my revisions to my code review early first thing in the morning. And it was a very nice process because I'd publish it and overnight it would get done because he was, one of the things you learn to appreciate is people that are good at code reviews, good at prioritizing,
Oh
like
yeah.
supporting the team. Because some people are a lot like, oh, I need to focus on my thing, code reviews. I'll do it if they bother me enough. And then there are people that are very good at prioritizing the needs of the team as a whole, which
Hmm.
means doing code reviews in a reasonable time. So that coworker was great because I'd do that. I'd publish the code review and it'd be there first thing in the morning.
Yeah, that's good. I was gonna give the opposite point because it works when the writer is on the US side, but it doesn't work with if I'm writing code to be reviewed in Mountain View. And
Mm,
well, it does work, but there's more lag time
yeah, oh, good
to
point.
that. And then this I actually had a very funny story about this where for one of the projects, not this one, like a couple quarters back, we have this project with Mountain View, and it's actually important for us to have more time overlapping because we were still ironing out some of the designs. And so what I had to do is I had to stay at the office till like 8, so that
Oh,
I
wow.
so we can align with the Mountain View time. But the helpful bit with that is I don't have to come in as early. So it's it all comes around.
Yeah.
And
I don't know. Is that something you'd be interested in talking about? This may be unrelated and we can sidebar it, but
yeah, we
I think like work times are interesting. I like people that prefer to come in earlier or later. I think this is maybe unrelated, but that's something that's interesting.
yeah, definitely. Actually, have a we're gonna have another topic on this one in the future.
Cool.
Probably with John again. So if you like John and you like the topic, subscribe to the podcast. Yeah, and then the last bit of the main stages I want to cover is your code is all written, it's all reviewed, it's all checked in, and the last bit, you probably think it's gonna be easy, and it always comes back and it's rolled out. And this is the process where you bundle all of your code and make it publicly usable to your customers. And the reason I said this might be difficult is, first of all, there's like infinite amount of production issues that you can run into. And then for like school projects it's slightly easier because you're probably just gonna submit platform. There's probably something like ready to use, or you're just gonna give a GitHub link for the project, and that's probably just it. And for industry, when you're trying to get a usable product out to people, there's a lot of things you have to go through. You got to go through, make sure all of your tests are sound, or they're like not crazily flaky. And then you gotta make sure you have all of the like there's a lot of sanity checking, and then you actually wrote it out, and you have to monitor it and make sure everything is good, no exceptions, and if there are exceptions, you have to fix them, and then you gotta continuously listen to feedback. And I understand these things might be very distant from our listeners who are still in university. This might feel very weird, and trust me, this is something you will run into, and it's better to have that mental preparation, right? Do you agree on that bit?
I do 100%. I actually had to do my first big rollout last week, and it was a much more stressful process than I imagined. In
Mm-hmm.
part because obviously in your day-to-day work you're dependent on other team services, but when you're doing a deployment, at least at AWS, your number of dependencies increases a lot because um, you need all the dependencies on all the infrastructure.
Yep.
And with these world scale products that these companies work on now, it's not just like, oh, I'm going to publish it to the server and it'll be good. It's like, no, you need, your huge amounts of infrastructure in, however many regions you're launching the product in around the world.
Mm-hmm.
I think AWS is like, I don't know, there's more than a dozen different regions that you have to deploy to. So you
Wow,
have to
that
be
many,
dependent
really?
on there's a lot. So you're dependent on all those regions working, and you need the correct approvals, right? Because you can't just be pushing. Something we're not really going to get into today is, and I had mentioned earlier, is kind of this continuous deployment and continuously delivering improvements to the customer. But you obviously can't just be pushing out whatever to the customer,
Mm-hmm.
right? You need to have checks and balances to make sure
Yep.
stuff is getting deployed at the right time. So you have to go through this whole approval process. And usually there are kind of timelines you have to reach, at least within Amazon. You have to, have all your approvals ready 2 days before you publish or something like that for a big launch.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a much more intensive process than you might think when you're thinking that it's similar to just pushing it up to the school server and letting the teacher deal with it.
Yeah, definitely. This is again, there's a lot more sanity checking than you realize there are. Both automatic and manual, and like we can expand on this like we can expand a full series on just like rollout and productionization, and
Yeah.
definitely.
And rollout also is one of these things that, like the code, it never ends. Like once you roll it out, you're not done. You have to continuously monitor it, and someone has to be on call to make sure if something, if a server dies or something,
Hmm.
that someone is or that the backup server comes online correctly, or whatever it is. You have to make sure it doesn't go down.
Yeah, definitely. And then, you might set up monitoring, and then there might be alerts firing, and then you have to
Hmm.
find out why it's firing. Like, if is this something you do, or it might be like a DDoS, some like externally, or there's a lot more things that could come in. And then this really illustrates the point where your project never actually ends. Even after rollout, you gotta monitor it, and then you might come back and do like another iteration, and this never is it's a never ending thing, which sounds bad, but this is the process where you will continue to deliver value, so it will not like it's not like something that just drags on and crush you as a human being. Uh it's a it's a thing that you have to keep in mind as you go along, and then you gotta make sure you are mindful to be still delivering values into
Yeah.
this product, and even after like months, years after the initial rollout.
Yeah. Well, what we call that, and I think most people call it, so that's like your operations load,
Yeah.
right? Like the amount of continuous work you have to do to make something just continue working.
Hmm.
Like once you've fully written it and fully deployed it, you still have this operations load you have to make sure it continuously works.
Hmm.
And managing that is another big aspect of industry that you don't get. I mean, it's just all this stuff we've talked about, but it's managing and making sure your operations load is maintainable,
Hmm.
because you can't be working 20 hours a week on just making sure your stuff is still working. So building that infrastructure and whatnot to have your operations load be maintainable.
Yeah, definitely. And then I think you meant to say 20 hours a day. You said 20 hours a week. I was like,
Uh,
what?
well, just on operations. Are you
Oh.
working 20 hours a week just on operations? Then
Oh.
you might have trouble.
Yeah, that's true. I was like, 20 hours a week. That sounds awesome. Yeah. Yeah. So those are the main stages. I hope you can sort of get some of the stuff out of this. We're just gonna go through them again. So you start with planning, where you define where you want to go and how much you're gonna go with this project, like within the timeline. Then you go into design, and then we skip this bit. Actually, you go into coding, but this is sort of like you gotta have to code at some point. You go to coding. With code reviews, which we talked about, and then eventually you go to the rollout. And actually, I missed a point here, missed a stage here, which is testing, and this is sort of part of the coding process, and we're gonna do in-depth episode a little bit later. Yeah, so these are the main stages that's usually involved in an industry project. These are sort of what you might be expecting if you are getting just about to get into industry, or you are fairly new. I'm sure I'm gonna get buzzed for like some senior engineers. It's not a thing, and yeah. So I hope that's useful.
Can I just want to throw out an action item for our listeners, which is if you are in a class that has a large semester long project, or you're in an internship, try to keep in mind these stages of real like industry production, and see if you can kind of try to model it in your university work,
Mhm.
because it'll be valuable to have experience with it
Yeah.
when you're first starting out. It'll make your first few months a lot easier.
Oh yeah, that's such a good point. And yeah, definitely do try to apply them. This might seem like a bureaucracy thing, but they exist. Bureaucracy exists for a reason, first of all. And then secondly, these are actually, structures that would give you value and increase your productivity in the long run. So definitely keep that in mind when you are going about your next project. Maybe like even for another great opportunity to experiment with this is for your side projects when you just like doing something out of passion. I have a problem where when I'm doing side projects out of passion, I tend to screw all the stuff and then just follow my heart. And I'm asking you to not do that and try to use these framework and try to use these stages that's already been tested in the field. Try to use them and give them a shot and see if they work. And you can, another thing is you can also tune it to your liking, because you can, because I since I work alone, there's not going to be any code reviews, and we're going to skip that, but I'm going to double down on testing, or I'm going to put in more effort into designing a proper rollout, and with a lot of monitoring, with a lot of safeguarding, and make sure like no bad version is accidentally pushed out or stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm actually going to go back and take issue with the no code reviews thing, because I think even on your side projects, just trying to take advantage of like version control, which I think you should be doing on anything you're writing, because otherwise it's going to be too easy to shoot yourself in the foot. And I think there is a difference between coding and reviewing your code. And even on your side projects, you can take time to take a step back and just look over all the code you've written and ask yourself, if someone else had to come in and look at this, does it make sense and is it maintainable?
Yeah.
I think that's still something you can do working by yourself.
Yeah, that's a good point. I take back that point. Definitely do what John says. He's more experienced in this bit than I am, and I'm also still learning. And do you try to like go back and just pretend you are reviewing this code, and then this will also be an experience to like practice reviewing code, which you also be doing, because code reviews are reciprocatory, right? You get people's reviews, and you also need to review it for other people. So
yeah, and these also like thinking like these are bureaucracy, these steps, but they're also kind of skills you can improve on. So don't think of spending time on this in university as wasted time. It's getting a jump on improving your skills on these things.
Definitely. Cool. I think we are close to the end here. We're going to try to compile it down, and I only just have 2 points to make here from everything that we talked about. One of them is university projects are not the same as industry projects, and in a lot of different ways. And secondly, whatever projects you're doing, be it university side projects or like a real life project, you can use this opportunity to practice having an actual framework of tackling these software projects out of the tips and out of the example stages that we've given today.
Well put. I agree completely.
Yeah. Do you have any other points to make?
I think you summarized it really well. I think that's a good summary of what we've discussed.
Cool. So that's it for this week's episode. Thanks so much, John, for coming back on again. I know it's super early in the Bay Area. Yeah, you have to coming on a Saturday, and thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, sure thing. It was a pleasure. It's great talking with you.
Okay, I actually almost forgot about this. There is a last section that we always do on this podcast is pick and plug. Where every week each of us will try to recommend something that's not necessarily for tech, but just good in general, that's have positive impact on our lives, or shameless plug something. So John, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, so I didn't have something to recommend because I was bad and didn't do prep and think about it. So instead, I'm going to plug a project I'm working on. If you like podcasts and you like learning about stuff, me and my friend Steve do a podcast, The Discomfortable Zone, which is a podcast about just learning about random things. And we sort of have a discussion about random topics and learn a bit more about it. We've talked about Marie Kondo and the Kondo effect. We've talked about big data. If you're interested in technology, it's a lot of fun. You can find us wherever podcasts are sold.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. Where can I find this podcast? Is it on YouTube or on iTunes? Or?
On iTunes. I don't think we have it on YouTube right now. We're also on Facebook. The Discomfortable Zone.
Okay, so the Discomfortable Zone is the shameless plug for the week. And I don't really have anything to recommend necessarily. I just moved, actually last week to a different flat, which is a little bit bigger, and I recommend taking a walk because the new flat I'm moving down to is a little bit further to the office. I have to walk around 20 to 25 minutes, which is still like relatively short compared to most of my colleagues' commute, and it was amazing how much I can get, out of the walk to the office and from the office back, just thinking about things. Or if I have my headphones with me, I would just put on some podcast episode and just listen on the way. It's such a good method to get into a state of reflection and thinking. And because you have to walk, so you're not like completely idle, so your mind still have to like work a little bit to make sure you walk, and then it has the rest of the power just to reflect on what's happened today, and what do I feel, and why do I feel this way. And if you haven't tried this out, definitely try it out on some local parks if you can. This is something I find to be very helpful in my personal life, and I definitely recommend trying that out for all of our listeners, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm a huge proponent of any way to get to work other than driving, especially something that involves walking or biking. So I'm all for that as well.
Yeah, cool. So again, thank you very much, John, for coming on to the podcast. It's been amazing to discuss all of this in detail with you. And also, because we share some experiences, so it's super helpful for me as well. Yeah, so again, thanks for coming on. And
thank you so much.
We hope to get you back some point, if you're not too busy with your own podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure, and I'd love to come back sometime.
Yeah, cool. So for all of our audiences, you can find our podcast on YouTube, Google Play, and also iTunes. You might not be able to find it straight away. Try to just search for the Compile podcast, and you should be able to find it. And if you have any comments on what we've talked about today, if you have a different routine of going about your software projects, or if you have just anything you want to talk to us, please comment on anything or just tweet at me. My tweet is always on the description, and just let me know, get in touch, and we hope to see you soon. And thank you.
Thank you for listening. Bye.